Stress is a significant problem for all managers. Typically someone who suffers stress will go to the GP will sign them off for 4 weeks. When they come back to work after the 4 weeks, the problem is still there. The stress is still there, and so all that they can do is go absent from work again. And so the cycle goes on. Managers need to understand how to manage stress. What I'd like to do is to introduce a model for management of stress such that managers can use this to tackle the problem rather than simply rely on external agencies such as GPs. So I'll go through a model, but I'd like to start with a case. I'd like to start with the case of a young accountant who was asked by her management to take on what's called expert user in software terms. So the accounts department, about 20-25 people, were taking on a new accounts package. They had an existing package. The package that was coming in was an upgrade. And so they needed an expert user, someone from the user group who would work with IT to implement this, or not to implement it, but to make sure that it was right. Now, in principle, this should have taken perhaps, let's say, an hour a week, something like that, just to confirm that the application was working correctly and that there were no unreported bugs. So the task was relatively light. So this young lady was an accountant and she'd volunteered for this additional work. What I'd like to do is to look at what happened to her. Now, in symptom terms, she suffered as a result of the software, the task that she was being asked to do. She suffered excessive or extreme migraines. She was off sick for quite some time, and she was recommended various other medicines in order to control and help her manage the problem. The issue there is that perhaps no one was actually looking at the root cause. The problem with the update or upgrade of software in this accountant's case was not that it was necessarily the wrong application or anything. It was simply that it was bought and it had bugs. So the task in hand of this young lady was to take bug reports from her colleagues, her 25 or so colleagues, report them to the vendor, and the next day or the day after they'd get another release. The expert user, the accountant, would then test that release and receive bug reports from all her colleagues because they were actively using it for real tangible work. And so she was effectively the go-between between the vendor and her colleagues. And let's look as we go through the model at what actually happens to her. What I'd like to look at specifically, and I'll mention this at the end, is what the root cause was. I'm particularly interested in the root cause, not just that there was too much work or whatever, but what in this case was the root cause. And let's see if we can use the model to establish what the root cause is. So let's begin by looking at what stress is. Stress has its origins in our fight or flight response. Effectively, when these things were roaming around and we were humans were fearful of them, when we encountered one of these, we had a choice. We could either fight it or run away. And what happened in our bodies was that our bodies would pump hormone, cortisol, to create adrenaline, and that gave us, that effectively made our complete body system ready for action. And ready for action. And of course, normally what happened in this particular case was that the moment was over. Effectively, it either killed us or we got away, and then we could relax, and we'll come to that perhaps a little later. But the essence of stress has in its origins, it has its origins in our fight or flight response. Now, we need to perhaps, in understanding stress, we need to perhaps look at a model, a useful model, and I'm particularly interested in again what stress is. I have it up here. The stress is the organism's response to its environment, and obviously in the case of the saber-toothed tiger, the environment's pretty rough just at the point in time. So it's the organism's reaction to its environment. Now, we have a model here. First of all, we should identify three specific things. The first is a stressor. Now, the stressor could be excessive amount of work. It could, of course, be the saber-toothed tiger, but in work sense, it could be an excess of workload. That is in the external environment. It's around the worker. It's around the employee. If that stressor is of significant level, and there is imbalance between what we call the internal environment of the organism, the human, and the external environment of the organism, if there's an imbalance there, then potentially the organism, the human, will suffer or feel a stress. Now, if we feel a stress, then the response to that is a strain. And a strain is typically something like a headache or the likes. It's an outcome of the process of stressor creating a stress. The stress then, in effect, manifests as a strain. And we have the idea here of the balance between the internal and external environment, a thing that psychologists and medics call homeostasis. But we also need to identify one very important point. We don't instantly all suddenly suffer stress when there is an imbalance. When there is an imbalance, we have the ability to actually cope. And it's that coping in the management of stress, it's that coping that we need to understand and understand how to achieve coping as opposed to suffering a strain. Stress in many cases manifests, and we know quite a lot about it from research. For example, in the military world, attacking forces suffer stress less than defending forces. And that's a very key point, because what that means is that the stressor in the case of attacking forces is only applied for a short period of time until the attack has been successful. Then they rest up. In the defending forces, the stressor is ever present. And as a result, it creates the stress. Coping perhaps exists initially, but then after a while, the system effectively breaks down and the strain is felt. And so we have this idea that stress is not always there in the case of attacking forces, but always there, the grind of defense. And so even small stresses, so small stressors, application of a low-level stressor for a long time is worse than the application of a significant stressor for a short period of time. We'll come back to that when we look at it. Let's go now to look at our young accountant who's helping with this IT problem or this IT installation. And let's look at it in terms of an integrated model, because managers need this integrated model in order to manage stress. Now here we have the person considered as a system, and we have inputs to the system. These are the stressors. We have typically an excessive workload, perhaps undue responsibility, although responsibility is of course a motivator, but here we're talking about an excess, perhaps excessive expectations. These are incoming to the person, and the outcomes are either a physiological response, which is the debilitating illness, or a psychological response where the person is consumed by negative thoughts and beliefs. So in effect, using the model previously, if these stressors are significant, if there is a break in the equilibrium, if there is a strain, the outcome is either psychological, consumed by negative thoughts and beliefs, or physiological, where there is a debilitating illness such as palpitations, increased blood pressure, or the like. And then down here is the idea that it's not all, these are not the only outcomes. We can also have the outcome we want, which is coping. And at the moment, in this rather simple model, the only thing we can do to create coping, if the person feels strain, feels stress, the only thing we can do is to remove the stressors, thereby allowing them to cope, moving the strains, the outcomes from here to here, to the coping. It's the only thing we can do. Or change the person, perhaps, because, as we know, stress is often a function of physical fitness, mental fitness, and the like. So we can actually help by doing things, the individual can do things to help themselves cope. But it's not a very complex, not a very complete model at this point in time. All we have is the idea that we can remove the stressors, and that's the kind of GP response to stress. So let's build the model more completely. Here's the first, and what we're going to do is we're going to add some moderators around the outside. The first thing is personal relationships. This is one of the reasons why soldiers fight in teams, because they build very close personal relationships. Those personal relationships moderate the relationship between the stressors and the strains, the outcome of stress. And where we in fact have a particular workload, a particular stressor, creating a debilitating illness in the person, the use of personal relationships can in fact moderate that. Now, what we had in the case of our young accountant assisting in the implementation of the software is in fact her relationships were beginning to get strained. The other 25 accountants were saying, look, help us out here. You're the representative. You're the one that has it within your power to solve this problem. And so personal relationships were strained. Now, the second moderator is incessant change. Change, we all know change has to happen, but it can happen in a planned fashion. And if it happens in a planned way with everyone aware, then it can act, it can be not affect the relationship. If we in fact have incessant change, then we exacerbate the relationship. We make it worse, the relationship between the stressor and the strains. And so if we can control change and make it planned, then we make it more likely that people will be able to cope. In the case of our young accountant, she'd first of all had a change in manager, and her old manager was saying, don't worry, just get through it. And her new manager was saying, I don't want to make any changes because I'm new and I don't know how to do, I don't know quite at this point what to change. So in effect, she was left without management support. Poor management support exacerbates, makes worse the relationship between the stressor and the strain. So in any management scenario, particularly where it has high stress or high stressor, such as high workload or a particular responsibility, then it's important that managers provide high quality management support, sitting with the individuals day by day. Just carrying on, the fourth of these, in the accountant's position, she was an accountant. She was not aware of software life cycles. She was not aware of software test. She did not have the demands, or she did not have the resources personally to do the job she was being asked to do. And here we see the idea that if demands exceed the resources that the person brings to the task, then it's very likely that we'll be working here in the stress area rather than coping. And so one mitigation, one way of coping or driving things to cope, is to make sure that all people in the company are appropriately trained and have the right resources. Continuing then, number 5, in this accountant situation, she was not able to control what was going on. Bugs were happening minute by minute throughout the day. She was being asked to assist. She was having to test the systems at night. She was doing a day job and then she was carrying on in the night. And these bugs were happening faster than anybody could fix them. So as soon as a bug was arrived and was fixed with a new version of software, that bug fixing broke the software and more bugs resulted. And so the young lady was unable to control the events that apparently she should be able to control. So one of the mitigations is to allow individuals, to make sure that the individuals are able to control the events. They're not driven by the system, they are able to drive the system. And that leaves us with the final one, which is no role clarity. Again, in the case of the accountant, she knew what she was doing as an accountant, but as a software tester, a software manager, aiding this system being put in, she had no real role clarity. She didn't know what she was there for. She'd been given the job as one thing, perhaps a little bit of career advancement, and it was turning into something totally different. And so there we have a total model for the management of stress. For a given stressor, managers are able to vary these 6 moderators and in turn move something which would otherwise be a stress situation, creating strain, creating physiological outcomes, creating psychological outcomes which debilitated the individuals. Using those 6 moderators, managers can move that situation to a coping situation. The way that's done is to use a classic control loop where the output is sensed, the reference performance is known and identified. If the reference performance, in the case of the accountant, of course, she went off sick, so that was an undesirable performance which would be logged here in the reference, and so the manager was then able to change some of the inputs, to change some of the things that he or she was in control of, the stressors and the moderators. And so the loop works by trying moderators, by changing the level of management, the management support, by perhaps training people, and then sensing, is my loop balanced? Have I created the right performance that I wanted? So I've created there an integrated model for the management of stress. I asked at the beginning, or suggested at the beginning, there was a root cause to our accountant's case. What was happening there with the accountant was that she'd taken on voluntarily a task which was to help implement a new software system. She was working on her main job and she was working on that job in the evenings. As a result, the workload was excessive. She wasn't able to control what was going on. The model was very badly broken and she suffered stress. Now, she suffered stress not because this was normal, but because this was abnormal. What had happened was the company had bought the software and said to the vendor, it's okay, we'll check it works. You don't charge us for checking that it works and proving to us that it works. We're going to take it and we're going to exercise it. We're going to make sure it works and we'll report to you. So the vendor then said, fine, that's okay. I will then do any bug fixes that are needed. Now, had there been no bugs, perhaps that situation would have been okay. But what actually happened was, of course, there was this process of fixing bugs, breaking the software every time the bug was fixed. What had happened was that the software had been bought effectively given what we know about the software, was bought effectively on the wrong contract. It should have been bought on a contract where the vendor was responsible for coming into the company and making sure it worked, not relying on a young accountant and who was only able to interface with IT, and IT were only interested in the fact that it had installed and was working. As far as they were concerned, the functionality and the fact that there were bugs was not an IT problem. It worked. It was then directly between this young accountant and the vendor. So in effect, for what we know about the software, it was bought on the wrong contract. It should have been bought on a more robust support contract. And so what we have here is apparently a normal business operation that went quite badly wrong. Of course, it's now cost the company because the young accountant has left the organization. It cost the company in management time. It cost them in bringing, for example, bringing us in to actually resolve the problem. It cost them in occupational health because they had to be involved as well. Significant costs. Possibly, even considering the recruitment costs, re-recruitment costs, we're probably talking about somewhere around £50,000. And I'd wager that it was not £50,000 to change the form of the contract, to bring that software under a different form of contract. But of course, that's perhaps in some ways hindsight. What should have happened here is management should have actually come on board a lot faster, used this type of model, analysed what was going on, and made changes. So we have now, using this type of model, an integrated approach to managing stress.